He had to leave army to fulfill his father's wish.
Doctor? Doctor?
But this pursuit got him into a battle with the most notorious drug mafia. They attacked his family, so he has to start the bloodiest cartel war in order to save his family. Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me.
On one condition, he's got to apologize.
The series kicks off with Eiite Horniman, a peacekeeping officer stationed at the border between Syria and Turkey. He's on high alert, checking all incoming vehicles when his father's lawyer, Ahmed Iqbal, arrives with urgent news. Ahmed tells Eiite that his father is in critical condition and has already secured permission from Eite's superior for him to leave his post. Faced with this emergency, Eiite decides to put his military career on hold and head back home. Eiite arrives at his opulent family estate, a symbol of their high-ranking nobility in England. He's greeted warmly by his older brother Freddie, his younger sister Charlie, and their mother Sabrina. Eiite rushes to his father, Archibald Horniman, the 12th Duke of Halstead, who is gravely ill. On his deathbed, Archibald gives Eiite crucial advice. Don't divide up the inherited land and protect Freddie from those who might exploit their family. Archibald's final words are followed by his passing. At the Duke's funeral, a woman named Susie Glass is seen, but she keeps her distance from the Horniman family. After the funeral, Charlie expresses her worry to Eiite about Freddie possibly selling the family's inherited land at the next opportunity. The family gathers to hear Archibald's will, which is read by Matt. The will stipulates that Jeffrey Seaham, the head of security, will continue in his role as long as he wants. Sabrina will get an annual living allowance, while Charlie will receive money specifically for traveling and a trust fund allowance that continues until she marries. All land and assets are left to Eiite, which disappoints Freddie and his wife Tammy. Freddie then reveals to Eiite that he's deep in debt £4 million to Tommy Dixon because of a failed business venture. Freddie had fallen into drug addiction and met Tommy, a Liverpool gangster. While in rehab, Freddie's inability to pay on time resulted in him owing even more money and being locked in a freezer by Tommy and his brother Gospel. Despite his reluctance, Eiite feels obligated to help Freddie in accordance with their father's wishes. Eiite withdraws all the cash he can, about £2 million, and asks Ahmed to withdraw £6 million from his father's account. Ahmed informs him there isn't enough in the account and suggests selling part of the Horniman land to Stanley Johnson, a wealthy Londoner. Eiite, pressured by Freddie's situation, agrees to meet Stanley. At this point, Eiite is introduced to Susie, who has been working with his father on a ranch. Susie reveals that the ranch brings in £5 million a year, which astonishes Eiite. She then takes him to the ranch's basement, where she's been processing marijuana, a secret business venture that Archibald had been involved in for the past 3 years. Susie offers to share some of the profits as thanks for Archibald's support. Eiite, facing the possibility of selling the ranch to cover Freddie's debt, worries that this could jeopardize Susie's operation. After discussing it with Ahmed, who advises against selling, Eiite decides to keep the ranch and updates Susie. Meanwhile, Charlie prepares to leave for her studies abroad. Susie uncovers Freddie's debt to a notorious Liverpool drug cartel and learns that Eddie's younger brother Jack knows Tommy and Gospel. Susie tells Eiite she'll find a way to help raise the cash to settle Freddie's debt. Later, Eiite is visited by Emery Stevens, Stanley's personal assistant, who wants to talk about buying the Horniman land. Eiite, having changed his mind, decides not to sell the family's inheritance. Susie then meets with Tommy, introducing herself as the daughter of Bobby Glass, a prominent mafia figure currently in prison. She offers to pay Freddie's debt without interest. Tommy agrees, but on the condition that Freddie pays within the week and makes a video admitting he's a fool. Eiite finally meets with Stanley, who is keen on purchasing the Horniman estate. Stanley offers a huge sum of money, but Eiite refuses to sell. Instead, Stanley, a wine seller, becomes interested in Eddie's collection of rare wine. They strike a deal, with Eiite selling some bottles for £3 million, which should cover Freddie's debt. Susie also manages to negotiate with Tommy, who agrees to accept £4 million. Eiite is impressed by Susie's negotiating skills. Things take a turn for the worse when Freddie uses the family money to bet on a boxing match with his friend Stinky Pete. Eiite and Susie rush to the boxing arena, where Eiite confronts Pete to get the money back. Pete lies, saying the money has already been handed over to a bookie. Eiite, frustrated, returns to his seat, where Jack informs him that Pete's lying and still has the money. Eiite goes back to confront Pete again, but Susie tries to calm him down. Freddie's boxer loses the match, and the money is declared Pete's. The next morning, Susie takes Eiite to Pete's house, where her henchmen have already beaten Pete up. Eddie retrieves the money. Back home, Eddie demands Freddie accept Tommy's condition, dance in a chicken costume to settle the debt. Freddie reluctantly agrees. Later, Susie brings Tommy and his henchman Jethro to the Horniman estate. As Jethro counts the money while listening to music, Tommy forces Freddie to wear the chicken costume and dance for him. So, Freddie reluctantly starts dancing in the chicken costume as Tommy demanded, but Tommy isn't satisfied and makes Freddie dance even harder, humiliating him further. Fed up and angry, Freddie secretly grabs his gun and shoots Tommy dead on the spot. Jethro, who just finished his task, is stunned to find Tommy bleeding and lifeless. Susie, realizing the need to cover up the murder, plans to take out Jethro too, but Eddie disagrees. While Eddie tries to figure out how to deal with Tommy's death, Jethro seizes the chance to run away and bolts into the forest. Eddie, Freddie, and Jeffrey chase him down and finally trap him. Freddie seems ready to kill Jethro, but Eddie stops him. Meanwhile, Jethro sends a message to Gospel about Tommy's death. Eddie wants to read the message, but Freddie grabs the phone and throws it into the lake, ready to face Gospel's wrath. Gospel starts to worry when he doesn't hear from Tommy, and then he gets Jethro's confusing message. Later, Jethro is locked up in the marijuana factory, and Susie puts her henchman Jimmy in charge of watching him. Back at Eddie's mansion, Eddie sends all the staff home so he can plan how to hide Tommy's death. Susie warns Eddie that Gospel is dangerous, hiding his ruthlessness behind a religious front. To get rid of Tommy's body, Susie contacts Felix, a pro at covering up crimes. Felix and his team arrive in special suits and get to work dismembering Tommy's body, using chemicals to speed up decomposition and burying him in the forest. Eddie then comes up with a plan to frame Jethro for Tommy's murder. He suggests a story that Jethro tried to steal Tommy's money and escape on a container ship to Australia with £2 million. Susie agrees, and Eddie, still fuming, slaps Freddie for causing more trouble. He then forces Freddie to put on the chicken costume again to make a video for their plan to pin the murder on Jethro. Meanwhile, Stanley invites Eddie to a party he's throwing. When Sabrina receives the invitation, she's shocked to find Freddie dancing in a chicken costume. Seeing Susie, Sabrina invites her to tea with her and her sons. During the tea, Sabrina asks Susie about Stanley, whom she only knows as her late husband's antique trading partner. Suddenly, Gospel calls Freddie's phone, and Eddie quickly takes Freddie aside to answer. Gospel asks about Tommy, and Eddie claims Tommy left after their business was done. Gospel decides to visit Eddie's house the next day to investigate further. When Gospel arrives, he brings his henchmen and shows Eddie and Freddie a strange final message from Jethro. Eddie lies, saying Tommy and Jethro had a fight over money. Gospel seems to buy Eddie's story and, feeling Tommy is gone for good, invites Eddie and Freddie to join him for a quick prayer before leaving. After Gospel leaves, Eddie plans to send Jethro abroad and heads to Jethro's place to grab his passport. While searching, Eddie realizes Jethro's friend is there, listening to music with headphones. To avoid any witnesses, Eddie kills the friend, but gets injured in the process. Despite the wound, Eddie rushes off to Stanley's party, where Susie is waiting. At the party, Susie is curious why Stanley is so eager to buy the Horniman land and suspects he might use it to expand his drug business. Eddie, not mentioning his recent troubles, introduces Susie to Stanley and his mistress, Roseanne. Eddie recognizes Roseanne, a direct descendant of King Leopold, from their school days. As Stanley and Susie discuss antiques, Roseanne confides in Eddie that she's okay being Stanley's mistress as long as she gets to travel on his private jet and luxury yacht. Susie guesses Stanley's watch is worth more than £10 million, impressing him with her knowledge. Stanley invites Susie to talk privately and offers her a partnership, but she declines and goes looking for Eddie. When she finds Eddie, he's with Roseanne, who is helping him bandage a gunshot wound. Susie, a bit jealous, asks about his injury. Eddie explains the situation and mentions he had Felix set up the crime scene to make it look like Jethro killed Tommy. The next day, Gospel finds Tommy's body in a car along with a rifle and visits Eddie and Freddie again. He shows them a recording of Freddie dancing in the chicken costume. Eddie tries to explain Tommy's visit, but Gospel mentions the rifle was Eddie's father's. Eddie claims it was stolen by Jethro, who must have used it to kill Tommy. Gospel seems to believe Eddie's story and leaves. Moments later, Eddie takes Freddie to the marijuana field in the basement of their farm, and Freddie is shocked to learn his father was involved in the drug trade. Meanwhile, Jethro leaves the country by ship, and Eddie asks Susie to arrange a meeting with Bobby, who is in prison. Eddie is surprised to find Bobby living comfortably in prison with special privileges. Eddie asks Bobby and Susie to end the contract for using the Horniman land. With compensation, Bobby refuses to cooperate. Jethro is on the ship with Felix, whom Eddie ordered to accompany Tommy's henchmen. Back at Susie's underground factory, Jimmy handles the delivery of the dried narcotic plants and meets a beautiful woman woman named Gabrielle at a restaurant. So, Jimmy and Gabrielle hit it off and chatted away, completely unaware that Gabrielle had sneakily grabbed his car keys and handed them off to her accomplice. They exchanged numbers, and it wasn't until Jimmy went to check on his car that he realized it was missing. The car wasn't just any vehicle. It was loaded with narcotics ready for delivery. Susie was furious when she found out. She told Eddie that the shipment was supposed to go to Tony Blair's gang. Tony might be a bit of a fool with money matters, but he's sharp, and Susie didn't want to piss him off. In their previous encounter, Susie had promised Tony that if the delivery went awry, she'd help him steal a green Lamborghini from Mercy's luxury car dealership. That's why Susie called Eddie, asking for his help with a car theft. Eddie agreed, but only on the condition that Susie's illegal operation must be moved off the Horniman family land immediately. Later, Susie introduced Eddie to Tony, who took him to the dealership where the Lamborghini was parked. Tony pointed out that the keys to all the luxury cars were kept in Mercy's office. He asked Eddie to hack the Lamborghini's lock system and copy it with a key Tony had provided. To pull off the heist, Eddie enlisted Freddie and Tammy to distract Mercy by pretending to be interested buyers. Meanwhile, Jeffrey, who was patrolling the forest near the Horniman estate, found Jimmy knocked out cold in the woods. At Mercy's dealership, Freddie and Tammy started browsing the cars. Eddie asked about the Lamborghini, and Mercy told him it wasn't for sale. Tammy, trying to impress Mercy, took a luxury car for a spin, which impressed Mercy and her staff. Eddie used this distraction to sneak into Mercy's office and search for the Lamborghini's key. While rummaging through a drawer full of car keys, Eddie was horrified to find a severed finger among them. He quickly refocused and found the key he needed, finishing just before Mercy entered the office. Eddie pretended to be waiting for a receipt for a car purchase. Freddie and Tammy then decided not to buy the car, claiming they didn't like its color, and the trio left the dealership. Back home, Jeffrey gave Jimmy a glass of water to help him clear the drug effects. Jimmy recounted how he lost the car at a restaurant, then ended up in a car with addicts heading to a party in the woods. He'd consumed drugs and passed out until Jeffrey found it. Susie suspected Gabrielle might be part of the gang that stole Jimmy's car. Later, Eddie and Susie discussed the theft plan in Eddie's office. Eddie mentioned finding the severed finger in Mercy's drawer and speculated that Mercy might be more involved than she let on. Eddie also had doubts about Tony's intentions with the Lamborghini. Despite the red flags, Susie insisted Eddie proceed with the plan. Meanwhile, Sabrina asked Jeffrey to keep a close watch on Eddie, concerned about the dangerous path her second son was on. That night, Eddie and Freddie put their plan into action. Freddie dropped Eddie off at the dealership and was supposed to head home, but he decided to wait outside instead. Eddie set off the alarm on one of the cars to distract Mercy's security. He sneaked in through the back and accidentally stumbled upon a man being held captive by Mercy's crew. Eddie decided to take the man along with the Lamborghini. He managed to escape with the luxury car, but Freddie was caught by Mercy's henchmen who were after Eddie. During the drive, Eddie removed the man's hood, revealing him to be one of Tony's henchmen and the owner of the severed finger. The man revealed that the Lamborghini's trunk was packed with drug packages worth millions. Tony had used Eddie and Susie to get his hands on these drugs. Furious at being manipulated, Eddie watched as the man tried to escape but was run over by a truck. Back at the base, Susie helped Eddie clean up the blood from Tony's henchmen. Eddie was shocked to learn that Freddie was captured by Mercy's men, who were demanding the return of the drug packages. Eddie and Susie raced back to the dealership with Tony in tow. When Mercy saw Tony, she was enraged and killed him right there. Meanwhile, Jimmy reached out to Gabrielle, still in disbelief that she stole his car. Gabrielle, smirking, and her crew set Jimmy's car and the drugs inside on fire. Later, Eddie discussed Susie's illegal business on the Horniman farm with Sabrina. Eddie promised to clean up the illegal activities. A few days later, a chaotic scene erupted during a tour at Bassington, a noble house, when an elderly man arrived naked and started shooting randomly. Meanwhile, Eddie and Susie revisited the plan to move her illegal business off the Horniman property. Susie was hesitant and more focused on expanding her business, which frustrated Eddie even more. The day after, Eddie and Sabrina went to Bassington's funeral, where they also saw Roseanne. Eddie found out about Bassington's heir, Max, who's a celebrity, and asked Roseanne to introduce him. When they met, Eddie proposed moving Susie's illegal business to Max's land. Max agreed, but had a condition. Eddie had to retrieve some secret documents that could cause a big scandal. With a ransom of £500,000, Max also asked Eddie not to look at the contents, claiming it was a secret of his father. Eddie agreed to the terms. Meanwhile, Sabrina brought Jeffrey a cup of coffee and asked him to help Eddie find a new place for Susie's illegal business. On the other side, Jimmy met Gabrielle in a park and talked about the narcotic plants he was growing. Eddie then met Susie at her boxing arena and suggested moving the business to Max's land. After that, Eddie met Frank, the blackmailer, with the ransom money, but Frank didn't bring the documents. They ended up at a restaurant, where a gangster showed up to collect Frank's debt. Eddie refused, leading to a fight. After they tired out, the gangster realized Eddie was well known and respected, so he gave Eddie Frank's address. Eddie and Susie went to Frank's house to get the documents. Meanwhile, Sabrina was at a sheep auction, checking if an acquaintance had a field of narcotic plants. Jimmy took Gabrielle to see the fields, without Susie knowing. Eddie and Susie brought Frank and the documents to Max. Eddie then revealed that the documents didn't contain scandals about the late Bassington, but showed that Max was a Nazi sympathizer and admirer of Hitler. Max then showed them his collection of Nazi artifacts. But things escalated quickly when Max and Susie pointed guns at each other. A shootout ensued, and Eddie, Susie, and Frank escaped while Max died in an explosion. Eddie's plan to move Susie's business to the Bassington land failed. Back home, Sabrina told Eddie about finding a new plot of land on a neighbor's property, 2 hectares, for Susie's business. Eddie told Susie, who seemed interested. Later, Susie visited Bobby in prison to discuss Eddie's plan to move their business. Bobby wasn't happy, believing Eddie could be a good partner in the business, but he warned Susie that he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate Eddie if he kept pushing to move the narcotics operations. Taking Bobby's advice, Susie tried to involve Eddie more in their cartel during a golf game. She explained how they moved narcotics to Belgium through the port of Zeebrugge, making $80 million annually. She mentioned their shipments were often seized by Belgian police, so they had to work with mafia boss De Groot. De Groot was causing trouble, so Susie sent Keith and Blanket to bring him to her. When De Groot arrived, Susie and Eddie took him to her underground narcotics factory. De Groot demanded more money, citing bribes he had to pay. Eddie, sensing something fishy, advised Susie against agreeing to De Groot's demands. Susie decided to increase the payment, but not as much as De Groot wanted. During negotiations, the power went out because someone stole the generator. Eddie and Blanket chased down the thief with Jeffrey's help and found it was a woman from the Gypsy Traveler group, the Ward family, who were forced to steal because theirs had been taken. Eddie retrieved the generator and let them go. Once the power was back, Susie postponed the negotiations and sent De Groot back to Belgium. The next day, Eddie and Susie visited the Gypsy settlement to donate a generator. J.P. Ward, the community leader, mentioned knowing about the underground narcotics cultivation. He offered to keep quiet if they let his community in on the business. Susie initially refused, but Eddie saw a chance to use the Gypsies to solve their distribution problems in Europe, bypassing the expensive De Groot. They agreed, and Eddie let the Gypsies stay on his family's land for a few days. J.P. suggested smuggling the drugs into Europe inside a statue of the Virgin Mary. Cutting out De Groot, JP's plan went off without a hitch, and Freddie praised Eddie's idea, thinking he had the potential to lead the cartel. But Eddie still wanted to get rid of Susie's illegal operations from his family's land. Not long after, De Groot found out about the smuggling with the Virgin Mary statue. One day, Susie and Eddie found themselves dealing with a problem. Cash had gone missing from their underground room. Eddie asked JP about it, which offended JP and made him want to take his community off Eddie's land. With JP's strong denial, Eddie started suspecting that De Groot had set up the Gypsy people, who had successfully handled the last drug shipment, to investigate. Eddie and Susie met De Groot at a restaurant. Eddie secretly poisoned De Groot and told him he'd get the antidote if he revealed who helped the mafia steal the money. De Groot eventually wrote down the accomplice's name, and Eddie gave him the antidote. Later, Eddie met with JP to apologize, even though JP punched him. Later, Eddie took Keith and Blanket to the forest, where JP and his men were waiting. It turned out that Keith had helped De Groot steal the cash, framing JP's community. Furious, JP shot Keith, who, before dying, told Eddie that Susie had killed Jethro. This made Eddie start to distrust Susie, fearing she might do the same to him. Meanwhile, Sabrina and Jeffrey reflected on their past affair, revealing that Jeffrey was Eddie and Charlie's biological father. The next day, Eddie met Jeffrey, seeking advice on whether Susie might kill him, as he planned to remove her business from his family's land. Jeffrey suggested that Eddie should stick to their business agreement while being cautious. Shortly after, Susie visited Eddie to discuss her business. She said she needed £15 million laundered over a few months for profit. Eddie agreed to work with her, and they decided to watch Jack's boxing match together. At the match, Eddie was introduced to Jack's promoter, Henry Collins, and a money launderer named Chucky Kubra. Chucky said it would take him 4 to 5 months to launder the $15 million. Eddie found this too long and secretly looked for another launderer. They decided to discuss it another day. However, after Chucky left to see his girlfriend, Susie spotted spotted Jack getting cozy with her on a surveillance camera, causing a fight between Jack and Chucky. As a result, Chucky refused to work with Susie, but she promised Eddie she would try to convince him again. Later, Eddie talked with Henry, who said he had better connections than Chucky for laundering money. Eddie also sought Roseanne's help to contact Stanley, despite her warnings about Stanley's cruelty. Eddie didn't mind. He later met Henry and Rick, who said they could launder Eddie's money through boxing bets within 2 weeks for a small commission. Henry vouched for Rick, and Eddie decided to use Rick's services. Unfortunately, Susie then told Eddie that Chucky had agreed to launder the money in 2 months without a commission, convincing Eddie to go with her plan. But when Eddie met Chucky, he said he needed 5 months, angering Eddie, who then canceled the deal. Without telling Susie, Eddie gave the money to Henry for Rick to launder. When Susie found out, she was furious, especially since they were discussing moving her illegal business off Eddie's family land, and she refused to relocate. Susie went to Jack's boxing match while Eddie met with Stanley, asking for help relocating Susie's business. Eddie promised a fair reward if Stanley could do it and asked him not to harm Susie's family. At the same time, Jack fought an Uzbek boxer, and Susie got a call to meet Henry in his room. There, Henry demanded Susie hand over her business, threatening to have the Uzbek boxer beat Jack if she refused. Susie, seeing Jack being beaten, reluctantly agreed to Henry's terms. After the match, she took Jack to the hospital, determined to get back at Henry, who had bribed the boxer and the referee. She blamed Eddie for ruining her business and refused to reconnect with him, despite his attempts to apologize and offer help. Later, Susie and Blanket sought revenge against Henry by killing the referee he bribed. Susie met with Bobby, who, knowing she'd committed murder, urged her to step back from the narcotics business and let his trusted people handle things, including Henry. Susie seemed frustrated, but couldn't refuse her father's order. Meanwhile, Eddie met Stephen, Stanley's assistant, asking him to find a list of 12 nobles whose land was used for Susie's drug operations. Eddie wanted to use this information to negotiate with Bobby for a peaceful resolution with Susie's family. At home, Charlie returned, heavily pregnant, but her family welcomed her warmly, despite not knowing the father's identity. Eddie briefly asked Sabrina about the nobles list linked to Susie's family business. At that moment, Sabrina admitted she wasn't sure, but recalled that Archibald had gone to an event with 11 other nobles, including Lord Tipsy Whitecroft, who Freddie knew was struggling with drug addiction. Once they learned this, Eddie took Freddie to visit Tipsy at the Whitecroft residence, which was pretty messy. Inside, they found a bunch of gang members who had turned the place into their base. When Tipsy saw Eddie and Freddie, he told them that the gang was sent by Susie's family because Tipsy hadn't renewed his contract for the narcotics plantation land. Eddie then asked about the list of 12 nobles doing business with Susie, and Tipsy said he had it in his journal. After getting the information they needed, Eddie and Freddie tried to leave, but were blocked by the gang members until Eddie gave up his watch to get out. Meanwhile, Susie got a package with a threat from Henry, warning her not to mess with his henchmen. She got worried, especially since her address had been leaked. Susie tracked down how Eddie got her address and discovered that Jimmy had given it to Gabrielle. Suspecting that Gabrielle had passed it to Henry, Susie and Eddie went to confront her. Susie, armed with a gun, questioned Gabrielle, who revealed she wasn't working for Henry, but for Stanley. Gabrielle had been paid £20,000 to steal Jimmy's car and burn it. Stanley also messed with Susie's drug shipments to Europe, hiring DeGroot and Keith, and controlled Henry to sabotage Susie's family business. Feeling betrayed by Stanley, Eddie decided to team up with Susie to take him down. The next day, Eddie visited Bobby in prison while Susie and Blanket were at the hospital with Jack, planning their next move. That night, Henry and his crew broke into Jack's empty hospital room, but Susie and Blanket quickly overpowered them. Henry revealed that Stanley was controlling Eddie. Susie believed him and contacted Gospel, telling him that Freddie had actually killed Tommy. Gospel, feeling betrayed, planned to attack Eddie and Freddie. Jeffrey, sensing trouble, warned Eddie. Eddie told his family to stay inside and rushed to his cabin with Jeffrey to get some guns. Gospel and his gang showed up outside Eddie's house, demanding Freddie come out. Bobby, knowing Gospel's plan, urged Susie to stop it, as Eddie wasn't under Stanley's control. Feeling guilty, Susie called Eddie to apologize and sent Jimmy to bring reinforcements to Eddie's house. As Freddie was about to go outside, Eddie stopped him, saying they had to face Gospel head-on. Just as things were about to get heated, Gospel got a call from Bobby, asking him to back off. So Gospel and his men left. Later, Susie and Eddie met with Bobby, who asked them to work together, especially since he had helped Eddie avoid Gospel's wrath. Bobby revealed he wanted to retire and sell his business to the highest bidder. Eddie and Susie decided to give pigeons to potential buyers to send their bids. They first approached Stanley, an old enemy, saying they'd let bygones be bygones and offered him Susie's family's illegal business. Stanley accused Eddie of betrayal sale, but Eddie denied it, showing that the phone numbers he'd given were linked to his family members, tricking Steven. They also offered the business to Mercy and Peter, Russian gangsters, who sent their bids via the pigeons. While Eddie was at home, Freddie suggested they should try to buy Bobby's business, believing Eddie could run a drug cartel. Convinced, Eddie started raising money, with help from Ahmed and Sabrina, to team up with Susie. Eddie also got Henry and the 12 noblemen involved to buy Bobby's drug business. Susie eventually agreed, though she didn't want Henry involved because he was responsible for Jack's hospitalization. A few days later, all the bidders, including Eddie and Susie, wrote down their bids and sent them to Bobby using the pigeons. Bobby read the messages. Meanwhile, Charlie met Jeffrey, who she knew was her biological father, as he'd taught her many things growing up. She finally admitted she was proud to have him as a dad. Back to Stanley, he was the highest bidder and told Steven to transfer the money to Bobby, not realizing it was all a trap. Bobby and Eddie had planned to catch Stanley in a tax evasion scheme, leading to Stanley's arrest. For the other bids, Eddie stirred things up, making the gangsters turn on each other, leading to more chaos. Eddie captured Henry when he delivered the money Eddie had asked for to buy Bobby's business. It turned out Bobby didn't actually want to retire, but wanted to expand his drug cartel with Eddie and Susie. The whole business sale was a ruse to eliminate their rivals. In the final scene, Eddie killed Henry in front of Susie, and Stanley ended up in prison, sharing a cell with Bobby.